Someone told me that with the time change, I get an extra hour for the sermon. Does that sound good with everybody? I only saw one no, and then a lot of, okay, we're going for it. I'm mostly kidding. Who is my neighbor? The expert in the law asked. This is something where I don't know if the translation is doing us many favors. One of my first discussions, if you will, I remember with this was after a Sunday school lesson. I was in elementary school, 4th, 5th grade, something like that. And one of my good friends was convinced that when we are taught to love our neighbor, it only applies to the people who live to your left and to your right. It is only your immediate next door neighbors, people who live in the homes next to you. And if you're feeling especially gracious, you can go 2 houses down. But that's all that the requirement is. And the expert in the law asks, well, who is my neighbor? Who does this apply to? If we look at the Greek word is plesion for neighbor. The online Bible, which I like the way they set up these definitions, it offers 3 definitions for us to start to understand this. The first definition it offers for plesion is a friend. The second definition it offers is any other person where 2 people are concerned. The other is the neighbor. According to the Jewish tradition and thought, any member of the Hebrew nation and commonwealth. So a neighbor is someone perhaps that is anyone that's a part of your group. The neighbor is always the other one. The third definition offered, which goes back to this parable, according to Christ, any other person, irrespective of nation or religion, with whom we live or whom we have a chance to meet. Another definition that I heard from one of the professors at seminary was instead of saying neighbor, he would define it as next one. Next one meaning the next person you meet is the neighbor. And after that, then it's the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So another way to phrase this is anyone we could come into contact with in any way is our neighbor. And in 2025, that's pretty much anyone in the world, right? Our neighbor could be anyone. History has been on my mind recently, especially these last few weeks. And with the concept of neighbor, we're going to try to do 60 seconds of brief history, collapsing a lot into a little. We're going to go back a little over 100 years. World War I. As World War I was going on, the United States, as is our tradition in world wars, we don't enter into the start of it. We wait a little while. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election, and his campaign slogan was America First. And his promise with that slogan was he would keep us neutral. He would keep the United States out of World War I. The problem is that German submarines kept sinking non-military vessels. And the outcry rised up, and there became public support for us to enter against Germany. And less than a year after his re-election, he led the charge for us to enter into World War I. If we know our history after World War I, after Germany was defeated with its allies, the victors took the punitive route. We wanted them to suffer, to learn their lessons so that they would never start a war like this again. We hit them financially. We took away their land. We punished their leaders. And did that work? No. No, it did not. Because not long after World War II started, right? And the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany. And I don't have to replay, I think, how World War II went, but needless to say, we also waited a while. And then whenever we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, again, forced to respond, enter into the war. But there was a difference after World War II. While there were still punitive things, while there was still punishment, especially for the leaders, and there were still reconstitution for payments that need to be made financially, the goal was not to smash them into the ground and grind them to dust, But the hope was for Germany and Japan, for them to be able to rebuild economically, to be able to join the larger community, and to not be in a position where they felt like they had to start a war again. So far, so good. See, the thing is, looking at history like this, sometime I think as a country, you just have to respond. Like with Pearl Harbor. Although we could debate if we should have been in the war already or not, it's a different debate, a different day. But what we learn from this is that actions that we take, whether it's as a country, individual, as a church, as a community, whatever, usually you get the same kind of action and response. It either matches the intensity or it's worse. If you punch someone, they're likely to punch you back. Or worse. We know through history, through our experiences, that violence begets violence, hate begets hate, war begets war. And as we see through history and the news of this week, tariffs beget tariffs, right? It's the way of the world. Respond in kind. The question is, how do we break those cycles? What is the role of the Christian voice, the voice of the church, when we see these damaging cycles around us? Jesus approaches it by first trying to shock people out of the routine, shocking people out of that mindset. The parable of the Good Samaritan is a really tough one for us to hear, because the hearers of this originally would have heard a Samaritan and gone, ugh. But today when we hear the word Samaritan, we most often hear it with another word right before it. Good. We hear about good Samaritans. When we hear the word Samaritan, we think about someone saving a cat from a tree or running into a burning house of a neighbor. We have a very different reaction. The first time I preached this parable, well, I'll tell you how I did it. You'll know what time frame it was in, but it was before I was ordained. I was doing pulpit supply and in my internship. Is I reframed the parable, and I forget who the first two were who passed by and did nothing. But when I retold the parable as the third person who stopped and helped, I said it was a member of Al-Qaeda. And the response was, oh, people were mad. But it shocked, right? And that's what Jesus' intention was to shock people out and say, the people who you think are least likely to help, they can still do good things, and you're passing by? I preached this again 4 years ago, and when I retold it in two versions. The first version had a Democrat stopping to help, and the second version had a Republican stopping to help. And people were mad. But I think doing both versions helped. If you ask the world today, how would we retell this parable? If you ask the church of our brothers and sisters, our siblings in Christ around the world, who is the shocking third person that stops to help, I can't help but wonder, is that us? Would people be shocked that a United States citizen stopped and helped? Is that shocking to them? Is that shocking for us now to hear? Does that get us angry? Does that get a visceral reaction? Because that's what Jesus was going for. He wanted that visceral reaction, that surprise. But the question, I think for us today that gets to the heart of it, is how do we reclaim these essential tenets of our faith as taught by Christ? For when Christ was asked, what's the most important? He says two things. Love God, love your neighbor. There's a reason, the pretzel prayer every Sunday, God, I love you. Help me to love others as you love me. Love God, love your neighbor. So how do we reclaim that? How do we speak that voice into a world that, again, needs to hear it? We're going to go back in history again, but not as far as World War II. We're only got to go back about 50 years. I'm actually going to share the words here from Sarah Kettler, an author who published a biography on Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, from the PBS show in 2020. Before I get into her word, which I like the way that she recapitulated this, I'll share that we may not all know that Fred Rogers was an ordained Presbyterian pastor before he got on TV. And his morning television show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on PBS, was the bulk of his ministry throughout his life. So now I'll get into her words detailing one episode. Though segregation was no longer the law of the land in America by the end of the 1960s, black citizens were still not embraced as equal participants in public life. This status was reflected at many community pools across the country, with white people preventing black people from sharing the water with them. It was in this atmosphere that Fred Rogers performed a simple but meaningful act in episode 1065 of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which aired on May 9th, 1969. Rogers invited Officer Clemens, a black police officer on the show, to join him and cool his feet in a small plastic wading pool. When Clemens sat down and placed his feet in the water right next to Rogers, the two men broke a well-known color barrier. In the 20th century, many communities in the United States created pools for children and adults to swim and splash in. However, few of these spaces welcomed black people. Many white people balked at the thought of unsegregated pools because they harbored the racist belief that African Americans were more likely to transmit disease. Pool goers were also separated by color due to bigoted fears about the need to protect the virtue of white women from predatory black men. Segregation was the law throughout the South, and though northern locales often didn't have Jim Crow statutes on the books, discriminatory behavior took place there as well. Segregation at pools was sometimes enforced by intimidation and violence, such as beating any black swimmers who tried to go in the water. Like buses and lunch counters, pools became a place of protest during the fight for civil rights. In 1964, a group of black and white people jumped into a segregated pool at a motel in St. Augustine, Florida. This enraged the manager that he poured acid in the water. Fortunately, it was diluted enough there were no serious injuries. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 put an end to the sanctioned separation of different races in public areas, but many white people opposed desegregation, including at pools. In 1969, pools around the country were still shutting out black people. Rogers knew that pools continued to refuse entry to black people in 1969, and racial tensions were rising. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated 1 year earlier. So Mr. Rogers sent a deliberate message on the May 9th, 1969 episode. During the show, Rogers asked Officer Clemens, a black police officer played by Francois Clemens, if he'd like to cool his feet with Rogers in a children's wading pool. Clemens initially declined the invitation, noting he didn't have a towel, but Rogers said Clemens could share his. The actions weren't complex. Two men took off their shoes and socks, rolled up their pants, and swished their feet together in a shallow pool on a hot day. But Rogers and Clemens demonstrated that a black man and a white one could peacefully share the water. When Clemens had to go, he used Rogers' towel to dry his feet, as promised. Rogers left the pool directly after Clemens and proceeded to use the same towel. That in itself was shocking to viewers. Their casual intimacy exposed the bigotry of denying black citizens access to pools or any other place in society. An episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood couldn't possibly erase the long history of discrimination in pools and elsewhere, but Rogers' actions were a step along the path towards black and white people being free to splash, swim, and live together. As Clemens said to the Pittsburgh City paper in 2018, I carried the hope inside of me that one day the world would change. And I do feel that the world still has not totally changed, but it is changing. We're getting there. Rogers' own life demonstrates how attitudes can shift. In the 1960s and 70s, he asked Clemens, who was gay, to keep his sexuality hidden for the sake of the show. Clemens, understanding how widely homosexuality was condemned at the time, obeyed. However, Rogers personally came to accept Clemens. Both Clemens and Rogers understood the importance of their pool scene. In 2018, Clemens told the Vermont News website, it was a definite call to social action on Fred's part. That was his way of speaking about race relations in America. The interaction remains emblematic of the messages of love, kindness, and acceptance that Rogers was trying to share with his show's viewers. In 1993, when Clemens made a last appearance on the show, he and Rogers recreated the pool scene, during which Clemens sang many ways to say, "I love you." On my note, you can find this on YouTube. I recommend watching it. But this time, Clemens didn't just use Rogers' towel. Rogers took the towel and dried Clemens' feet himself. Clemens, who saw a connection to Jesus washing his disciples' feet, found the act very moving. As he later said, "I am a black gay man, and Fred washed my feet." That concludes her words. What are the ways that we show love to our neighbors? When the lawyer asked Jesus, "Who was my neighbor?" Jesus' response was a shift from the expert of the law thinking about himself, how he can justify himself. What do I need to do? Who do I need to do certain things for so that I can receive salvation? Switch the shifting from thinking about himself to the other. We saw the same thing with the story that I don't have enough time left to do justice unless we want to give me an extra hour. I'm ready if we're ready. With Mary and Martha. That as Martha was cleaning and preparing and providing hospitality, something that Simon the Pharisee did not provide just a couple Sundays ago we heard about. She is there working, perhaps cleaning and cooking and thinking, "I'm doing this all by myself," inwardly focused. And when she asked Jesus, "Hey, can you send Mary to help in here?" Perhaps maybe a little more passive aggressively even than that. What does Jesus say? Mary's where she needs to be. We need to stop focusing on ourselves and letting resentment build, letting hate build, letting the downward cycles continue, and to put ourselves in the shoes of our neighbors, realizing that in today's day and age, our neighbor is the world. It's anyone and everyone. And what are the ways that we can share a wading pool, share an encouraging word, to show with our actions, with our words, that the love and grace we receive and we share is never ending. And it will ultimately triumph. And the world is changing. We're not to heaven yet, but we can help us get one step closer. Amen? Amen.